I'm sorry, ma'am. Your name isn't on the list. That sentence landed right at the gates of the Naval Academy, under the slanting May sunshine that touched lightly against my shoulder. I looked at the young soldier, his uniform still unwrinkled, his nameplate gleaming like it had been engraved just this morning. In his hands was a tablet, displaying 3 familiar names: David Hayes, Margaret Hayes, Jessica Hayes. Mine wasn't on it. And this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. The familiar black SUV slowly rolled through the gate. James stepped out, first hair, neatly combed, dress whites, crisp as ivory. His posture straight like the world itself had been designed to salute him. He saw me, his eyes swept past like wind, then leaned toward his wife. Just loud enough for both the guard and me to hear. My sister, she's just a desk jockey. Should have married a real officer instead of playing with spreadsheets. No one laughed, but no one pushed back either. My mother suddenly found her brooch clasp to be incredibly fascinating. My father said nothing, his brows furrowed like I was the one causing a scene. And then they walked past me, as if I were a piece of luggage no one had claimed. I didn't get angry, didn't speak up, didn't shed a tear. Only my breath, slowed by a beat. And something inside me quietly closed shut. It wasn't the first time I'd been written out of the family frame. But today, standing in the middle of that wide-open courtyard where the red brick buildings whispered about honor and legacy, I no longer felt hurt. I felt clear, clearer than ever before. They didn't know. They thought I came here today just to watch James get honored. But no, I didn't come as his sister. I came with my rank, and what's about to happen will make sure they never forget my name again. I stood still at the academy gate, where the young soldier remained dutifully in place, trying hard to maintain his professionalism, even as he clearly struggled with the silence stretching between us. In his eyes, I saw no contempt, only discomfort, a flicker of guilt over enforcing an error that clearly wasn't his. I gave him a small nod, a quiet release for both of us. And then, in that pause, where no one spoke, the past returned not like a film reel, but like a scent I hadn't smelled in years, like the smell of grilled meat, mixed with my father's cologne as he threw his arm around James, like the sugary icing on a sheet cake dissolving into nothing on my tongue. Suddenly, I wasn't 36 anymore. I was 17, and invisible, 19 years ago. Another sunny afternoon, not unlike this one, the day James received his acceptance letter from the Naval Academy. Our father, a man whose emotions rarely extended beyond a nod or a frown, had lit up like I'd never seen. He laughed out loud, held the envelope high, and said, "That's it. Hayes's legacy, 3rd generation." Meanwhile, I stood in the corner, holding a box. Inside it, a gold medal from the National Cryptography Competition. 1st place, nationwide. Not a small achievement for a teenage girl, but my father never asked what I was holding. He was too busy calling relatives, ordering barbecue supplies, and setting up a backyard celebration fit for royalty. And that night, when the party began, the world revolved around one person. Not me, James. I remember the cake. Blue and white. Congratulations. Future Admiral in bold frosting. I helped cut it, refilled drinks, smiled politely. No one asked what I'd been up to that week. No one knew I'd been offered a full ride to a federal cybersecurity program. I brought the medal upstairs later that night, placed it gently into a small wooden box at the back of my closet. Beside it, a letter from the judges, full of praise, insight, belief. It became something I'd return to in silence, proof that I'd mattered to someone even if no one in my own house had noticed. The real fracture came a few years later. I was accepted into naval intelligence, one of the most selective, demanding pipelines in the service. I'd made the choice on my own, did the research, completed the prep, said no to safer, more obvious paths. And when I told them, it went exactly as I feared. I stood in front of my father. He was reading the Wall Street Journal. Of course, I said. I got into the Navy's intelligence program. I start next month. He didn't even look up. Just flipped a page. After a few seconds, he muttered, "Intelligence? Huh, that's just support staff. Hayes men don't do desk jobs." My mother, folding towels in the background, tried to smooth it over. "It's safer, David. At least she won't be in harm's way." Safer, as if that were the goal, as if I were a delicate object, meant to be displayed, not deployed, as if I couldn't be brilliant and brave at the same time. I walked back to my room that night and understood something I hadn't wanted to see. In their eyes, I would always be Plan B, the compromise, the footnote. And yet, 15 years later, here I was, standing in front of another gate, another man with a checklist, another moment where I was being told I didn't belong. But this time, something was different. This time, the past didn't sting, it clarified. Because they didn't know that just a few weeks ago, I'd been deep in the tank, a command center buried beneath layers of concrete, where the hum of servers replaced the sound of applause. They didn't know that I'd led an operation that intercepted a potential ambush on a civilian oil tanker, or that I'd identified a secondary strike team using only a thermal signature and 5 seconds of drone footage, or that the team I saved that night included James. He never knew. No one ever told him. Just like no one ever told him that last spring. It was my intelligence directive that rerouted his ship away from a coordinated missile trap. He thinks I push paper, but I push back against war. Every single day. And I do it without credit, without recognition, without being listed. Because that's what leadership looks like when you're used to being invisible. You stop asking for the spotlight. And you start owning the battlefield quietly, precisely, completely. The guard at the gate shifted uncomfortably, unsure if I needed help. I gave him a polite smile. "It's fine," I said. "I'm waiting for someone." And I was not for James, not for my parents. I was waiting for the right moment, because the stars on my shoulders today weren't earned to impress my family. They were earned to protect people like James even when he didn't know it, even when he didn't deserve it. They thought today was about him, about medals, about recognition. But it's not. It never was. Today is about the girl who buried her first gold medal in a box under her bed and the woman who learned how to wear her next one on her chest. They think I sit behind a desk all day. I shuffle papers, highlight PDFs, and organize training slides. I count the number of commas in briefing memos and refill the office printer when it jams. They say it with that particular tone, the one that rides the line between casual dismissal and subtle pity, like my life is a placeholder between failures. Like, I missed the memo on what real service looks like. What they picture is beige, beige walls, beige uniforms, beige ambition. But they have no idea what that desk actually looks like. Because my desk is buried 3 stories underground, in a black site with no name, they call it the tank. There are no windows, no clocks, no cell signal, just a cold hum of servers, the glow of screens, and the constant silent pressure of decisions that matter more than anyone above ground will ever understand. It was a Tuesday that bled into Wednesday. In the tank, time is elastic, irrelevant. We eat at odd hours, sleep in shifts, live in a rhythm that isn't based on the sun, but on global intel flow. That night, we were coordinating a high-risk hostage rescue in the Red Sea. 12 civilians, oil workers, held at gunpoint on a hijacked tanker. My analysts were working in silent precision, parsing drone feeds, flagging encryption trails, and mapping heat signatures in real time. And I was the one in the middle, eyes locked on 6 giant curved screens, earpiece in, shoulders square, voice steady. "Viper 1, confirm visual. You're 2 miles out. Copy that. Control. Breach in 90 seconds. On the thermal overlay, The tanker glowed a soft orange. Clusters of red marked the hostages. Brighter points, more erratic, were the armed pirates pacing the decks. The SEALs were ghosts on the edge of the screen, moving with perfect silence. I studied the bridge overlay. Something felt off. Eagle eye, sharp and thermal on the port stern. What's that shadow coming in? There it was. A second boat. Small. No lights. No engine on record. 6 more heat signatures. An ambush. They were setting up a kill box. Viper 1. Abort. Immediate recall. Hostiles at your 6. Repeat abort breach. You're walking into a trap. There was a beat of silence. Then, confirmation. And just like that, 12 civilians, an entire SEAL team, and one certain bloodbath were pulled back from the edge because I saw something the enemy didn't think we would catch. That was my job. Not typing, not spreadsheets. War in its most invisible, precise, and deadly form. 2 hours later, the mission was shut down. The hostages still alive. The SEALs safe and exfiltrated. I was still in the tank, breathing shallow. The adrenaline fading. I took a long sip of lukewarm coffee, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in 6 hours, exhaled. That's when my personal phone buzzed in my pocket. A single text message. I glanced at it, expecting something from my assistant. But it was from James. Enjoying DC. SIS. Don't work too hard. I hear those copy machines can be vicious. My thumb hovered over the screen. For a long second, I just stared. He had no idea. No clue that I had just prevented his teammates from being annihilated. No clue that the hostage op he'd been casually tracking from his ship had come this close to a massacre. No clue that it was his sister who stopped it. To him, I was still the quiet one. Still, the girl who never made varsity soccer. Still, the sibling who played with computers. He had no idea I was the final firewall between chaos and safety sometimes for people he knows. I didn't reply. I turned off the phone, set it face down, and went back to work. You see, James wasn't cruel. Not exactly. He just never questioned the story. The story where he was the hero, where I was the filler. The story our parents had written when we were kids, where his bruises on the football field were badges of glory, and my science fair ribbons were cute little hobbies, where his path through Annapolis was a birthright, and mine through cryptography school was a detour. The truth is, James is a good officer, competent, charismatic, respected by his crew, but he never once asked me what I do, what I see. What does it cost? Because that would mean acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, someone he thought was in the background was never in the background at all. The day after that mission, I was summoned to a private briefing room at the Pentagon. General Miller was already waiting, a coffee in hand, files laid out before him. He didn't start with formalities. Just leaned forward and said, "You saved them, Admiral. 12 civilians. A whole team of operators. And you didn't blink." I nodded. It wasn't pride I felt, it was something colder, sharper. He studied me. "You've served 15 years without recognition. That ends now." He slid a folder toward me. Inside was a citation for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest peacetime honors. "It's time the world knows who you are," he said. "And I think," he added with a glint in his eye, "it's only fair your family finds out, at the same time everyone else does." That's when the plan began to take shape, not out of revenge, not out of spite, out of something deeper, a need for the truth to be undeniable. Let them think I push paper, let them underestimate me, let them ignore me at the gate, because in 5 days, at James's own ceremony, when the 4-star general calls my name across the Naval Academy's parade ground, when 2 stars gleam from my shoulders in full dress uniform, the only sound louder than the standing ovation will be the silence of their disbelief. And that silence, that's the sound of checkmate. The tank doesn't hum, it breathes. It inhales intel and exhales decisions. It pulses with encrypted tension, the kind you can't see but you feel, like static before a storm. It's not much to look at, just concrete, steel, and silence. The ceilings are low, the walls are soundproofed. There are no windows, no clocks, and no sunlight. The only glow comes from rows of curved screens casting their soft blue light on the faces of men and women trained to operate in the dark. This is where I live. And if my family could see it, if James could stand in the middle of this place for 10 seconds, they might finally understand. But that's not how this world works. This battlefield has no applause. I arrive every day at 05:00. No uniform, no fanfare, just clearance, retina scan, biometrics, and silence. My name doesn't appear on rosters. My face isn't printed on hallway plaques. But when things go wrong, when diplomats disappear, when encrypted chatter spikes in a new war zone, when a satellite goes offline for routine maintenance, I'm the one they call. Rear Admiral Jasmine Hayes, Commanding Officer of the Strategic Threat Analysis Division. A title no one in my family has ever heard. And that's exactly how it's designed to be. Inside the tank, you stop thinking in hours. You start thinking in timelines: 3 minutes until the drone passes, 9 minutes until interception window closes, 20 minutes until a convoy either gets where it's going or doesn't. We coordinate missions that don't exist. We reroute aircraft through airspaces we pretend not to fly over. We make decisions that never get debated in Congress but shape the world anyway. And here's the thing. You don't get to freeze. You don't get to feel. You see a red blip on a satellite map, and you move people, move assets, move pressure points. The tank is war stripped of flags and glory. It is data and instinct. It is cold judgment and even colder resolve. It's what I'm good at. There's a reason people like James never understand people like me. His war is linear, clear. He's trained for the sound of engines, the smell of fuel, the crack of orders on a ship deck. Mine is quieter, dirtier, more complex. He engages after the threat has arrived. I'm tasked with seeing it long before it forms. They give me 8 analysts, 1 massive surveillance net, and the authority to authorize action before bullets are even loaded. But no medals, no press, no stories at family dinners. Only once did my world almost surface. It was Operation Carbon Veil, an unmarked vessel drifting into U.S. waters. Signal dark, hull double-layered, thermal masked. James was on patrol off the Gulf at the time. He later told our father he intercepted a potential smuggling vessel and scared the bastards off. I didn't correct him. I didn't say that the only reason he intercepted that ship was because I'd flagged a data signature from 3 ports away, tracked it through a Syrian proxy, and rerouted his destroyer 90 nautical miles overnight. I didn't say that I'd been watching him in real time, that I knew he was 2 minutes from boarding a vessel laced with IEDs disguised as medicine barrels. I didn't say that I saved his life that day. Instead, I smiled politely while he relived the story over burgers in Dad's backyard. That's what it means to operate in the shadows. You save people who will never know. You win wars they never hear about. You give your youth, your time, your sanity, and what you get in return is silence. But silence is powerful, because it means I never needed applause to know my worth. There was one night I nearly broke down. It was midwinter. Everything outside was frozen, including me. We were tracking a double-blind arms deal between 2 factions operating through encrypted messaging apps. My analyst hadn't slept in 30 hours. My eyes burned from the monitors. I'd been watching a man call sign Reaper 17 sit alone in a safe house for 6 days. He barely moved, didn't eat, didn't touch his phone. That kind of stillness doesn't mean peace. It means precision. He was waiting for the right moment to kill someone, and I didn't know who. At 03:18 he finally moved. I saw it. The way he stood, The way he tucked a burner into his waistband. The way his jaw clenched before he left the room. I saw it and I knew. I issued a red flag. Froze 3 diplomatic visas. Had an entire embassy lockdown ordered in under 6 minutes. An assassination attempt that would have ignited an entire region, averted. And then I sat there, alone, staring at the blank monitor. And I remember wondering if I hadn't seen that twitch in his hand. Would anyone else have? Would James? Would my father? Would anyone in my life even believe me if I told them? And that's when it hit me they wouldn't. They didn't see me as capable of this kind of war, because they never looked hard enough to see anything at all. Back in the tank, the operation room has no corners to hide in, no shadows to shrink into. That's ironic, considering all we do is work in them. But that's also the point. In here, there's no hierarchy of last names or family legacies. There's only one question: can you keep the world from unraveling for one more day? And I can. So I do. On the wall of my private office is a small, locked drawer. Inside is a photograph. It's the only personal item I've ever brought into this room. It's a photo of me at 18. The morning I got my first security clearance. Still wearing borrowed heels and carrying a secondhand laptop bag. I keep it because it reminds me of who I had to become and who I had to leave behind. I had to walk away from their version of me. From the girl they didn't take seriously. From the sister who would always be smart, but not military. From the daughter who would never quite fit in with the Hayes legacy of medals and battlefield scars. That girl doesn't exist anymore. She died in the silence of this room. Somewhere between encrypted reports and a decision that saved a life James will never know I protected. What lives now is something sharper, colder, and far more powerful. Because in a few days, the tank will open for just a moment. The shadows will part, and I will step forward into the light. Not to explain, not to justify, not to beg for space at the table, but to take what I've earned. And when they see me walk across that stage, when they hear the words, Rear Admiral Jasmine Hayes echo across the Naval Academy parade grounds, they won't see the quiet sister anymore. They'll see the woman who learned how to win wars without firing a single shot. And this time, they won't be able to look away. It came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office windowless, quiet, and artificially lit, like always buried in the aftermath of a cyber breach attempt on a naval contractor. I had 6 reports to review, 2 analysts on standby, and 1 diplomatic crisis simmering in the South China Sea. It wasn't the kind of day that left room for interruptions, but my personal phone buzzed. Once, a soft vibration in my coat pocket. I almost ignored it, but something about the timing, the way the silence cracked, made me pull it out and glance. It was from James. Just his name on my screen was enough to stir something tight and cold in my chest. We hadn't spoken directly in months, not since the family's 4th of July barbecue where he'd thrown an arm around my shoulders in front of his friends and said, with a beer-slicked grin, "Hey sis, you ever gonna put in for a real Navy job? Or do the paperclips keep you busy enough?" I had smiled, a practiced one, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes. But this time, it wasn't a snide comment said aloud. It was worse, because it was written, permanent, thought out, chosen. Can't believe you're skipping the big weekend. Annapolis won't be the same without you. Jasmine, try not to drown in those spreadsheets while the rest of us are out here earning medals. That winking emoji hit harder than it should have. I stared at it for a long time. The cursor blinked. My breath didn't. It wasn't just sarcasm. It was certain. Certainty that I was nothing more than background noise, that my life's work, 15 years of classified service, 10 of them spent commanding shadow-level operations that shifted global power balances, was still invisible. To James, I was a woman in beige slacks who filled out checklists and updated PowerPoints. He had no idea I'd saved his life. Twice. No idea that last spring, when his destroyer picked up a suspicious radar ping off the Persian Gulf, it was my team that flagged the satellite deviation. It was I who personally called a 3-star at Joint Ops to redirect their route 10 degrees west. That 10 degrees saved them from sailing into a triangulated missile trap. He didn't even know a trap had been set. Because that's the thing about people like James. They think danger is only what you can hear or feel. They don't understand that sometimes the biggest threat is silence. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I set my phone down, face down, turned the screen off, and just sat there. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself feel it. Not anger, not disappointment. Grief. Grief for the fact that my own brother, flesh and blood, someone I had covered from the shadows more times than I could count, didn't respect me enough to even ask what I actually do. He just assumed that if he hadn't heard applause, there wasn't a performance worth watching. Assumed that my silence was submission, not strategy. Assumed that because I didn't wear my medals on my chest, I must not have earned any. But I had. And now, someone else had noticed. 2 days later, General Miller summoned me again. His assistant met me outside the E-ring, where all the quiet conversations happen, the ones that don't go on the record. The general didn't waste time. He gestured to the armchair across from him, poured me a cup of black coffee, and slid a single folder across his desk. The president signed off on partial declassification of Operation Blackwater. My hand stopped mid-reach. "It's time, Jasmine," he said. "The world's going to know who you are. And if I may, so should your family." I blinked. He didn't mean in theory. He meant publicly, on stage, at James's ceremony. At first, I hesitated. It felt personal, vengeful, not my style. But then I thought about that message again. That winking face, that tiny digital smirk from a man who had built his identity on being the golden child, the hero, the real Navy. And I realized this wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, letting him and everyone else see what they chose not to see. Not with an argument, not with a fight, just with the truth. Unavoidable, undeniable, unignorable. The decision was made. I would attend the ceremony, not as Jasmine, my older sister, not as the quiet one, but as Rear Admiral Hayes. I'd let the announcement speak for itself. Let the world discover me the way I'd built myself, quietly, but thoroughly. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to stand there and let the weight of my stars do the talking. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment. The lights are off. Phone face down on the kitchen counter. I opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were dozens of mission patches from operations that never made the news, folded memos with redacted text, challenge coins from men who would never publicly thank me, but had told me in hushed voices that I'd change the outcome of their lives. And beneath all of it, buried at the bottom, was my very first medal. Still tucked in the velvet case from the Defense Cybersecurity Division. Still shining, untouched by public light. I held it in my hand for a long time, and for once, I didn't feel the ache of hiding. I felt the quiet pride of someone who no longer needed to explain. Because what was coming, what James didn't know, would make everything clear. He had sent that message thinking he was joking. But that message lit the fuse. And the explosion. It was scheduled for this Saturday, at 0900. Front row, full uniform. The flag was raised high. He would see it all. The name, the rank, the stars. And there wouldn't be a damn thing left for him to say. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of precision only Annapolis could deliver, sky crisp and blue, lawns manicured to military standard, and a brass band warming up with restrained pride just beyond the arches. I pulled up in a government-issued black sedan, its tinted windows reflecting sunlight like secrets too long buried. The driver, a quiet, enlisted staffer, gave me a nod as he opened the door. My heels touched the pavement with a click that sounded far louder in my head than it did in the air. For a moment, I simply stood there, breathing in the salt-heavy wind coming off the Chesapeake, the smell of ceremony, of legacy, of every uniformed memory stitched into this academy's red brick walls. I'd been here before, but never like this. Today, I wasn't just attending. Today, I was stepping out of the shadows. The entrance security had changed. This time, the petty officer at the gate didn't ask for ID. He saw the uniform, the silver stars on my shoulder boards, and straightened instantly. "Ma'am," he said, snapping into salute, voice tight. "Welcome to the Naval Academy. No hesitation, no confusion, just respect." I returned the salute with a simple nod. Inside, the space opened into the main ceremony grounds. Folding chairs are set in perfect rows, a stage draped in navy blue and gold, flags rippling gently in formation. Guests were already seated: family members, officers, dignitaries. Somewhere out there, I knew my parents were seated in the front left section. And James, he'd be backstage, prepping his speech, probably rehearsing in the mirror, probably expecting a standing ovation. He had no idea what was coming, and I didn't need him to. I was escorted to the VIP area behind the stage. General Miller was already there, flanked by 2 other flag officers and a Marine Corps general I vaguely recognized from a joint task force years ago. He greeted me like a colleague, not a subordinate. Firm handshake, familiar smile. "You ready to make history, Admiral?" I gave a small smile in return. "I'm ready to stop hiding." He nodded, something warm flickering behind his steel-colored eyes. We waited as the crowd settled. The band played a final march, and then was silenced. A young lieutenant took the stage, microphone in hand, and began the ceremony with a confident, practiced voice. Opening remarks, introductions, brief bios. Each name earned polite applause, as expected. And then, now presenting the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal to Lieutenant James Hayes for meritorious service in support of forward operations. The applause was louder now, sharper, familiar. James stepped onto the stage like he belonged there. He did the nod, the stance, the polished smile. He took the medal, posed for the photograph, then approached the podium. I watched from the VIP box, hands folded calmly in my lap, heartbeat steady. He launched into his speech. Charming, patriotic, rehearsed. He thanked the Navy, his COs, the men and women under his command. He thanked our father, Captain David Hayes, for showing me what it means to serve. He glanced at our mother, and to my mom, for every prayer and every late-night letter. Then, predictably, a wink to his wife. And to Jessica, for being my lighthouse in every storm. I waited. I already knew it wasn't coming. He didn't mention me. Not by name, not by title, not even as a vague sibling nod. And in that moment, he didn't just omit me, he erased me. A final stamp on a lifetime of being background. He finished to thunderous applause, smiles, handshakes. He stepped down, the medal catching sunlight, and I rose. General Miller didn't take his seat. He stepped to the podium, voice low but commanding. "Before we conclude today's ceremony, we have an unscheduled addition, a recognition long overdue, one that has, until now, remained classified." The crowd stilled, every face lifted. Today, we recognize a different kind of service, the kind not fought with weapons, but with insight. Not in the open, but in the shadows. The kind that saves lives long before danger makes itself known. He paused, letting the tension breathe. This officer has led the most significant intelligence operation of the last decade, Operation Blackwater, a mission that dismantled a global threat network and directly prevented regional warfare. There was a visible ripple through the crowd, whispered questions, nervous glances. My father leaned forward. James furrowed his brow. And then, "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to recognize Rear Admiral Jasmine Hayes." The air left the ceremony like a held breath. And then uniform after uniform, officer after officer stood, not out of shock, Not out of courtesy, out of protocol, out of respect. Even the Marine general beside me stood first, nodding once as I moved past. I walked toward the stage, head high, shoulders straight. No nerves, no fear, just the weight of truth sitting calmly on my chest. As I passed the guest section, I didn't look at my family, but I felt them, my mother's gasp, my father's sharp inhale, and James staring as if he'd seen a ghost he thought he buried long ago. On stage, General Miller handed me the Distinguished Service Medal. He pinned it slowly, deliberately, leaned in close. "They see you now," he whispered. I nodded once, and then, turning toward the audience, I took my place in front of the microphone. I didn't speak long. I didn't need to. Service comes in many forms, I said. Some of it happens in the light. Some of it doesn't. But all of it matters. And for those of us who operate in silence, let this be proof. The absence of applause doesn't mean the absence of impact. Thank you. The standing ovation that followed wasn't for the speech. It was for the truth, for the weight of it, the precision, the undeniable reality of a woman they had underestimated for far too long. I stepped back from the podium, calm, quiet, and whole. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't someone's sister. I wasn't an accessory to a family legacy. I was the legacy, and everyone could see it. The ceremony was over, but the shock wasn't. The reception hall buzzed with admirals, commanders, senators, and staffers. Glasses clinked. Laughter floated on the air like confetti. A string quartet played something elegant in the background. People mingled and shook hands and whispered names they hadn't known before. My name was everywhere now. I stood near the center of it all, still in uniform, still freshly decorated. My medal glinted under the chandeliers. And for once, I didn't have to explain myself. I wasn't chasing respect anymore. It was surrounding me. Then, through the crowd, I saw them, my family. They moved together tight, contained. A formation of confusion. My mother held my father's arm with one hand and clutched her purse with the other like a life raft. My father's jaw was clenched, his eyes unreadable. And James looked like a man who had just walked into a building expecting to be the keynote speaker, only to find out the event wasn't about him at all. They didn't come over immediately. They watched, hesitated, calculated. I waited. I wasn't going to them. Let them come to me. A congressman from Virginia shook my hand, offering congratulations and asking about cybersecurity implications in post-conflict zones. I answered calmly, clipped, and practiced. I'd given briefings like this before, just never with my name out in the open. Over the man's shoulder, I caught the moment my father nudged James forward. And just like that, they were moving. I handed off my conversation to a deputy undersecretary and turned. There they stood, face to face with me for the first time, as me. Rear Admiral Jasmine Hayes. My mother blinked rapidly. My father's expression remained fixed, unreadable. And James, he looked like he was holding in 1,000 things and had no idea which one to say first. He didn't wait long. "Rear Admiral Hayes," he said. His tone was tight, almost venomous. That was quite a performance. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't have to be. The bitterness was sharp enough to cut without volume. I tilted my head slightly, eyes steady. "Thank you. I thought it was overdue. You lied to us," he snapped. Louder this time. "You lied to all of us for 15 years. People nearby turned slightly, catching the tension in the air. I didn't flinch. I didn't lie. I said evenly. I just stopped explaining myself to people who never listened. James let out a short, humorless laugh. "You made us look like fools. You let us sit there and talk about you like you were some paper pusher, a nobody. You stood there and let me believe I was the only one carrying on Dad's legacy." I blinked once, slowly. "Because you needed to believe that." "James?" He stared at me, You needed to believe you were the only hero, the only one who mattered. You never once asked me what I do. You just decided it didn't count. That shut him up. My father finally spoke. You could have told us. I turned to him. Would you have believed me? His jaw twitched. You never even asked. I continued, my voice still calm. When I joined the intelligence corps, you called it support staff. When I got promoted to commander, you asked when I was getting married, and when I made flag officer, none of you even noticed I stopped showing up to family dinners because I was running black site briefings in 4 countries. My mother looked down. I took a breath. I stopped telling you because I was tired of shrinking myself to fit your story. The silence after that was heavy. Then General Miller's aide approached, smooth, sharp, professional. Admiral, a private conference room has been prepared for you. Might be a more comfortable place to continue this discussion. I nodded. Thank you, Lieutenant. He gestured toward the side wing of the reception hall. My family followed me. No one said a word. The conference room was small, wood-paneled, and quiet. The kind of space designed for hush-hush conversations and closed-door diplomacy. The aide closed the door behind us, and it was just the 4 of us. No medals, no applause, no distractions. Just the truth. James didn't hold back. He exploded the moment the door shut. Why would you do this? You could have told me. You could have... I cut him off. Not with volume, but with finality. You never wanted to know. You wanted a sister who stayed in your shadow, who clapped when you succeeded, who stayed quiet when you dismissed her. He looked stunned. I never dismissed. 4th of July. I interrupted. You put your arm around me in front of your buddies and joked about me transferring to a real job. I had just come from authorizing a cyber strike that prevented a chemical weapon from reaching a civilian hospital. Last Thanksgiving, you asked if I still worked in that office with the printers. I had just finished testifying before a classified subcommittee about vulnerabilities in our defense satellite grid. You didn't dismiss me because I was small. You dismissed me so you could feel big. James looked away, jaw clenched, hands in fists. My father sat down slowly in one of the leather chairs. For the first time, he looked old, tired. All this time, he muttered, and I never knew. I softened, just a little. You didn't want to know, my mother finally whispered. We thought you were unhappy. No, I said quietly. I was unseen. That's worse. She covered her mouth with one hand. Her eyes welled up. But you're brilliant, she said. You always were. I looked at her. Really looked, and then, finally, let some of the ice melt. Then why did you always treat me like I was just waiting for a husband? She flinched. James exhaled. The room was quiet again, thick with everything that had never been said. And then my encrypted sat phone rang. The sound was sharp, distinct. A chime that meant only one thing: critical alert. I pulled it from my coat, glanced at the screen, then looked up. I have to take this. I walked to the door. My hand paused on the handle. I turned back. One last thing. James, I said softly. I love you. I always have. But I will not be dismissed by you again. If we're going to have a relationship from this point forward, it will start with respect. And with that, I walked out, left them in the silence they created, and stepped back into the world I had built, one decision, one mission, one invisible battle at a time. 6 months later, I stood in my parents' living room, a place that once felt like a silent tribunal, now softened by something I hadn't felt here in years. Curiosity. Genuine curiosity. The air was quiet, not tense, just still, as if the house itself was holding its breath, watching me move through it, not as the forgotten daughter, but as someone fully seen. I didn't know what to expect when I came back. An awkward dinner, a forced apology, a strange mix of guilt and eggshells. But what I found was something different. It started in the hallway, the same hallway I used to walk through with a backpack full of unread awards, where photos of James in uniform lined the walls, all golden frames and glowing smiles. Now, there was a new frame, centered between his graduation portrait and my father's commissioning photo from the 70s. It was me, in full dress whites. I stood at attention as General Miller pinned the Distinguished Service Medal to my chest. The background was a sea of uniforms standing in ovation, their heads turned toward me like sunflowers to the light. I paused in front of it, not to admire it, just to acknowledge it. It was real. It had happened. And now, apparently, it was part of the family story. My father was in the living room, crouched low with a soft cloth in one hand, polishing the glass of a brand new display case. Cherry wood, beveled edges, glass panels on all four sides. Inside, the shelves were lined with folded flags, plaques, and shadow boxes. I recognized the lower shelves immediately: my grandfather's WWII medals, my father's Vietnam service pins, James's commendation from the Gulf deployment. But it was the top shelf that made me pause. Centered with symmetry and care was my Distinguished Service Medal. On one side, a framed citation from Operation Blackwater. On the other, a small bronze plaque with my name, rank, and years of service. And just behind it, mounted with a brass holder, was a second photo, one I hadn't seen before. It was I, seated at a console inside the tank, caught mid-action, monitors glowing, expression calm, focused, precise. I didn't even know someone had taken it. I stood there, quietly, as my father finished wiping a smudge on the glass. He hadn't noticed me yet. When he finally did, he didn't straighten right away. He just nodded, like this was normal, like this had always been here. Built this myself, he said, voice steady. Took a while to get the lighting right. I glanced again at the case. Each section was lit from beneath, not above, so nothing cast a shadow over the medals, so no one would ever be hidden again. I swallowed a lump in my throat I hadn't known was there. It's beautiful, I said. He rose slowly, a little stiffer than I remembered. He didn't hug me. That wasn't his way. But he looked at me fully, no deflection, no judgment. The old case wasn't big enough, he said. Wasn't telling the whole story. I nodded once. That was all I needed. In the kitchen, my mother pulled a tray of cookies from the oven. Chocolate chip, crisp edges, gooey center. My favorite since I was 8. She smiled at me, soft, real, and reaching all the way to her eyes. He started that project the week after the ceremony, she said, placing the tray on the cooling rack. Didn't tell anyone, just ordered the wood, cleared out the old case, and got to work. I blinked, unsure what to say. She stepped closer, wiping her hands on a towel. He said something that stuck with me. She added, he said, "We didn't raise one kind of hero. We just raised one too quietly." I bit my lip to keep it from trembling. "Mom, no," she said gently, reaching up to smooth my hair the way she used to when I was little. "I miss so much. I made you smaller without realizing it. I thought I was protecting you, Jasmine, but I was just failing to see you." We stood there for a long moment. No apologies, no tears, just presence. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive like lightning. It seeps in like sunlight through old curtains. Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, potatoes, and wine. And for the first time in memory, the table didn't feel like a battlefield. No lectures, no sideways praise for James, no subtle digs, just conversation. At one point, my father cleared his throat, a gesture I'd always associated with a shift in tone. He looked at me directly. "With your position now," he said carefully, "I imagine managing personnel must be difficult. Officers and civilians in one building. That's not easy." I blinked, stunned by the question. It was the first time he'd ever asked about what I actually do. Not what it meant. Not how it compared. Not whether it was appropriate for a woman. Just the work. I nodded. It's like chess, I said. Except every piece has opinions and access to classified files. He laughed. Not loudly, but genuinely. And that, somehow, mattered more than any speech. Later, James talked about a new training protocol being implemented on his ship. Funny, he said, glancing sideways at me. Some of the risk assessment procedures feel oddly familiar, like something I've heard before. I caught the hint. Subtle, but sincere. A quiet recognition. That was his way of saying thank you. I didn't need more than that. After dinner, we drifted out to the back porch. The swing still creaked the same way it had when we were kids. The fireflies blinked like Morse code in the fading twilight. James and I sat side by side, a bottle of beer between us, passed back and forth like a truce offering. We didn't say much. Didn't have to, but eventually, he spoke. I was a jerk. I didn't answer. He sighed. I needed to be the hero so badly. I didn't know how to handle the fact that maybe I wasn't the only one. Maybe I wasn't even the best one. I turned toward him. It was never about being better, James. It was about being seen. He looked down. I see you now. I smiled, not from triumph, but from something deeper. Peace. And I see you too. Not as the golden boy, not as the center of every photo, just my brother. Human, flawed, real. Like me. That night, before I left, I stopped in the hallway one more time, looked at the wall. The new frame gleamed under the hallway light, not brighter than the others. Not bigger, just there. Equal, earned, undeniable. The legacy hadn't changed, but the story finally had. The swing creaked like it always had, slow, rhythmic. That same wooden groan that used to lull us into drowsy silence on humid summer nights. James and I sat side by side, just like we did when we were kids, knees brushing as the swing moved back and forth. The fireflies blinked across the yard, and a cicada buzzed somewhere off to the right, reminding me that time hadn't stopped just because we had. It felt strange to be here, in this exact place, after everything. Strange, but not wrong. James hadn't spoken since we stepped outside. He sat with his forearms braced against his thighs, bottle of beer hanging from one hand, staring at the far end of the yard like it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. I waited. Not because I needed an apology, I didn't, but because I could feel the words rising in him, something raw, something real. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. No bravado, no sibling banter, just something brittle and uncertain. I was never trying to hurt you. You know, I didn't respond right away. The truth was, I believed him. That was the problem. You didn't have to try, I said softly. It just happened. Over and over. He nodded, gaze still fixed on the shadows of the backyard. I don't know why I did that, he admitted. I just assumed if I kept being the loudest, the flashiest, the most obvious, then maybe I wouldn't disappear. I turned to look at him. He didn't mean to disappear from our family. He meant from our father, from the weight of legacy, the Hayes name, the pressure to be a man like Dad. I spent my whole life thinking I had to prove something. He continued. Like if I wasn't a carbon copy of Dad, I wasn't worth anything. He let out a bitter laugh. And then there you were, doing the real work, the dangerous, unglamorous, classified stuff. And I never even saw it. His words weren't theatrical. They didn't land with punchline energy or scripted regret. They just hung in the air, honest, plain, necessary. You weren't supposed to see it, I said. That was the point. My job required it. Yeah, well, he shook his head. That doesn't make me feel any better. Silence fell between us again, the swing creaking gently under our weight. For a while, all we heard was the sound of night around us, branches shifting, insects chirping, the occasional breeze ruffling the porch screen. And then James said something that caught me completely off guard. I told myself for years that I had it harder than you. I glanced sideways, surprised, because I was the one out there. He went on. Deployments, bad chow, harsh weather. You know the gritty stuff. I thought I was the one carrying the real burden. He finally looked at me. But then I started thinking, what's harder? Jasmine, being out there in the open? Or saving the world while your own family thinks you're a secretary? I didn't smile. I didn't laugh. Because it wasn't a joke. It's not a competition, I said. He nodded. I know, but if it were, you won. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest loosening just a little. I didn't need to win anything. James. I just needed to stop disappearing. He nodded again, slower this time, like he was letting the weight of that sentence settle into his bones. You're not invisible anymore. And then, in a voice so low I almost missed it, he added, you never were. That was the moment it happened. The quiet reckoning, not forgiveness, because there was nothing specific to forgive. Not reconciliation, because nothing had been shattered beyond repair. Just recognition, an acknowledgement of the space I had carved out for myself, of the respect. I had waited for far too long. We sat for a while longer. He told me about his ship, the new XO he couldn't stand. A near disaster involving a faulty radar and a miscommunication with port control in Singapore. I told him about my analysts, how young some of them were now, how smart, how terrifyingly fragile the future felt in their hands. It felt normal. It felt like siblings, not the kind we pretended to be in holiday photos, but the kind we were finally learning how to be. Somewhere in the house, we could hear Mom humming softly in the kitchen. The screen door creaked open behind us a few minutes later, and Dad stepped out with 2 more beers. He handed them off without comment, then sat in the old wooden chair across from us, looking out at the same dark yard. I used to think strength meant standing tallest, he said after a long pause. But you proved me wrong. It was all he said, but somehow, it was more than I ever expected. I turned back toward the yard, resting my bottle on the swing armrest, and for the first time since the ceremony, I let myself lean back, let myself relax into this new version of home, a place where I no longer had to shrink to be loved, a place where legacy wasn't defined by gender, or medals, or whose voice was loudest, a place where I was no longer the footnote to someone else's story, just Jasmine, seen, heard, present. The porch light flickered once, an old bulb struggling in its socket. James got up and tapped the fixture with the bottom of his bottle. It blinked back on. He sat down, gave me a small grin. Still got it, I smirked. Barely. We sat there as the night deepened, saying less and understanding more. And for the first time in our lives, the silence between us didn't feel like distance. It felt like peace. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair in soft, even strokes, half awake, half floating in a stillness I wasn't used to. There was something eerie about the house at this hour. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that used to feel heavy, like waiting for the other shoe to drop. But today, it didn't carry the same weight. No longer did I feel like a guest in my own childhood home. No longer did I feel like I had to brace for judgment over coffee or sidelong glances during breakfast. It was just me, just Jasmine, not the other one, not the sister. Not a role to play, but a person to be, and that, more than any medal or salute, felt like the deepest win of all. Later, I walked back into the living room where the display case sat like a sentinel in the corner. It still caught me off guard. Not just the fact that my medal was there centered, honored, but that someone had decided it belonged there without me having to fight for it. That was the shift. That was the part no one saw from the outside. You can carry stars on your shoulders and still feel like a shadow, until someone finally says, you don't need to earn space here. You already have it. And then one morning, You believe them. I stood in front of that case for a long time, hand lightly pressed against the glass, watching the reflection of myself in the surface. This medal, this photo, this legacy, it wasn't a weapon. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition, but more importantly, it was mine. Mine, because I'd built it. Mine, because I didn't wait for permission to start. Didn't wait for praise to continue. Didn't wait for acceptance to mean something. There's something profound about choosing yourself long before anyone else does. And there's something even stronger about no longer needing them to. The front door opened behind me. James stepped in, keys jingling in his hand, hair still damp from his morning run. He slowed when he saw me by the display. I figured you'd want to head out before the traffic hits. I nodded. Yeah. Got a briefing back in DS. By 2. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he gestured at the case. It looks right now, he said. I raised an eyebrow. Now. Yeah. He cleared his throat. Before, it was just incomplete. He walked over, stood beside me. We looked at it together. You know, he added. There was a time when I thought this thing, he motioned to the medals, the photos, was supposed to make us who we are. But standing on that stage watching them stand for you made me realize it was never about the display. It was about who kept showing up, over and over, quietly, relentlessly, no matter who noticed. I didn't respond. I just let the truth of it land. He turned toward me then. I'm proud of you, Jasmine, not just because of the uniform, but because you didn't need any of this to already be who you are. But it's about damn time everyone else caught up. That made me smile. And not the tight, polite kind I'd worn for years. A real one, because I knew, in that moment, he meant it. No performance, no prideful detour, just honesty. We hugged before I left. It was awkward at first, half laughing, half cautious. But eventually, it settled into something solid, something overdue. At the door, he clapped me on the shoulder in a way that didn't feel dismissive, but grounding. Next time you save the world, he said, maybe give me a heads up so I can stop telling people you do logistics. I smirked. Deal. As long as you stop calling me SIS in group texts. He cringed. God. Yeah. That's over. Thank you, I said, stepping onto the porch. Not for the joke. For the growth. He nodded. Fair. The drive back to DC was quiet. No music, no calls. Just me and the road and a stillness I hadn't felt in years. And somewhere, about an hour outside the city, I realized something else. This wasn't closure. Closure implies an end. This was alignment. Finally, my external life had caught up with my internal one, and the parts of me I used to protect, hide, defend, they no longer needed armor. They just needed space. Later that week, I walked back into the tank. Same halls, same faces, same low mechanical hum echoing through the deep underground command center. Except now, people looked at me differently, not because I wore my stars differently, but because they understood now what those stars meant. Some nodded quietly. Some stood when I entered the room. A few left notes on my desk. Watched the broadcast. It was time. Proud to work under you. Your speech reminded me why I joined this division. Thank you for making us visible. That last one stayed with me, because the truth is, I didn't do any of it to be seen. But visibility matters. Not for ego, for legacy. And the kind of legacy I wanted to leave wasn't one built on obedience or spectacle. It was built on perseverance, on showing the next Jasmine that she wouldn't have to choose between service and self, that her worth would never again depend on the lens of someone else's understanding, that she could lead from the front, the back, or the shadows, and still deserve to be counted. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, lights low and bourbon in hand, I picked up my phone. Not to answer emails. Not to open news alerts. Just to send one message to myself. I opened my notes app and typed, "Your worth isn't theirs to define. It never was." And now they know. I hit save, not because I needed the reminder, but because someday, someone else will. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair in soft, even strokes, half awake, half floating in a stillness I wasn't used to. There was something eerie about the house at this hour. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that used to feel heavy, like waiting for the other shoe to drop. But today, it didn't carry the same weight. No longer did I feel like a guest in my own childhood home. No longer did I feel like I had to brace for judgment over coffee or sidelong glances during breakfast. It was just me, just Jasmine, not the other one, not the sister, not a role to play, but a person to be. And that, more than any medal or salute, felt like the deepest win of all. Later, I walked back into the living room where the display case sat like a sentinel in the corner. It still caught me off guard. Not just the fact that my medal was there centered, honored, but that someone had decided it belonged there without me having to fight for it. That was the shift. That was the part no one saw from the outside. You can carry stars on your shoulders and still feel like a shadow, until someone finally says, "You don't need to earn space here. You already have it." And then one morning, you believe them. I stood in front of that case for a long time, hand lightly pressed against the glass, watching the reflection of myself in the surface. This medal, this photo, this legacy, it wasn't a weapon. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition. But more importantly, it was mine. Mine, because I'd built it. Mine, because I didn't wait for permission to start. Didn't wait for praise to continue. Didn't wait for acceptance to mean something. There's something profound about choosing yourself long before anyone else does. And there's something even stronger about no longer needing them to. The front door opened behind me. James stepped in, keys jingling in his hand, hair still damp from his morning run. He slowed when he saw me by the display. "I figured you'd want to head out before the traffic hits." I nodded. "Yeah. Got a briefing back in D.C. by 2. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he gestured at the case. "It looks right now," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Now? Yeah." He cleared his throat. "Before, it was just incomplete." He walked over, stood beside me. We looked at it together. "You know," he added, "there was a time when I thought this thing," he motioned to the medals, the photos, "was supposed to make us who we are. But standing on that stage watching them stand for you made me realize it was never about the display. It was about who kept showing up, over and over, quietly, relentlessly, no matter who noticed." I didn't respond. I just let the truth of it land. He turned toward me then. "I'm proud of you, Jasmine, not just because of the uniform, but because you didn't need any of this to already be who you are. But it's about damn time everyone else caught up." That made me smile. And not the tight, polite kind I'd worn for years. A real one, because I knew, in that moment, he meant it. No performance, no prideful detour, just honesty. We hugged before I left. It was awkward at first, half laughing, half cautious, but eventually, it settled into something solid, something overdue. At the door, he clapped me on the shoulder in a way that didn't feel dismissive, but grounding. "Next time you save the world," he said, "maybe give me a heads up so I can stop telling people you do logistics." I smirked. "Deal. As long as you stop calling me SIS in group texts." He cringed. "God. Yeah, that's over." "Thank you," I said, stepping onto the porch. "Not for the joke. For the growth." He nodded. "Fair." The drive back to D.C. was quiet. No music, no calls. Just me and the road and a stillness I hadn't felt in years. And somewhere, about an hour outside the city, I realized something else. This wasn't closure. Closure implies an end. This was alignment. Finally, my external life had caught up with my internal one, and the parts of me I used to protect, hide, defend, they no longer needed armor, they just needed space. Later that week, I walked back into the tank. Same halls, same faces, same low mechanical hum echoing through the deep underground command center. Except now, people looked at me differently. Not because I wore my stars differently, but because they understood now what those stars meant. Some nodded quietly. Some stood when I entered the room. A few left notes on my desk. Watched the broadcast. It was time. Proud to work under you. Your speech reminded me why I joined this division. Thank you for making us visible. That last one stayed with me. Because the truth is, I didn't do any of it to be seen. But visibility matters. Not for ego, for legacy. And the kind of legacy I wanted to leave wasn't one built on obedience or spectacle. It was built on perseverance, on showing the next Jasmine that she wouldn't have to choose between service and self, that her worth would never again depend on the lens of someone else's understanding, that she could lead from the front, the back, or the shadows and still deserve to be counted. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, lights low and bourbon in hand, I picked up my phone, not to answer emails, not to open news alerts, just to send one message to myself. I opened my notes app and typed, "Your worth isn't theirs to define. It never was. And now they know." I hit save, not because I needed the reminder, but because someday, someone else will.